My name is Evelyn. I am 34 years old. And the night my parents celebrated selling the house my grandfather left me, I placed one sheet of paper on their dining table and watched every smile disappear. They thought the sale was complete. They thought the money was theirs. They were wrong. My mother had already ordered champagne. My father had invited my younger brother and his wife to discuss how they would divide the proceeds. $280,000 had moved through escrow that morning, and not one person in that room believed I could stop them. I had spent most of my life being the reasonable daughter, the quiet one, the woman who checked every document twice, paid every shared bill on time, and apologized even when someone else had hurt me. That habit came from my work as a forensic accountant. Numbers rarely lie. People do. For 3 weeks, my parents had ignored my calls. Then my mother sent a short message telling me the old house was finally gone and that I should be grateful they had handled the burden for me. The burden. That was what she called the place where my grandfather taught me to bake bread. The place he promised would always be mine. The place named in a trust my parents insisted had never been finalized. I arrived at dinner carrying a thin gray folder. My father barely looked at it. He told me the lawyers had checked everything. My brother leaned back in his chair and asked whether I had come to make another emotional scene. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I only placed the final page in front of my mother and watched her hand freeze around her glass. Before I tell you what was written on that page, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Then leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. My mother read the page twice. My father stood so quickly that his chair struck the wall. Then my brother reached for the document. I pulled it back. Because the paper did not only prove the house belonged to me, it proved my parents had sold something they had never legally owned. And in the lower corner was a signature that should have been impossible. My grandfather had signed it 6 months after my parents claimed he was no longer capable of making decisions. I grew up believing that love was something you earned. If I worked harder, if I stayed quiet, if I never caused trouble, maybe then my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at my younger brother, Ryan. They never did. Ryan was charming, spontaneous, and somehow every mistake he made became someone else's responsibility. When he failed college twice, my parents blamed the professors. When his landscaping business collapsed after less than a year, they blamed the economy. When he borrowed money and never paid it back, they called him unlucky. I was expected to solve problems. He was expected to be forgiven. Looking back, I should have seen what was coming years before it happened. I simply refused to believe my own parents could cross that line. After graduating with a degree in accounting, I specialized in forensic financial investigations. My job was to trace hidden assets, examine contracts, and identify inconsistencies that most people overlooked. My coworkers joked that I could spot a forged signature from across the room. It wasn't talent, it was habit. Growing up in my family taught me to notice every small contradiction, every forgotten promise, every missing receipt. I built my career by trusting evidence instead of emotions. Ironically, I ignored that rule inside my own family. My grandfather, Walter, was the only person who ever made me feel truly seen. He never compared me to Ryan. He never asked why I wasn't married or why I worked such long hours. Whenever I visited, he would smile and say that careful people change the world one quiet decision at a time. The house was his pride. A modest 2-story home surrounded by maple trees on the edge of town. Nothing extravagant, but every corner carried a memory. The porch where we drank lemonade during summer storms. The old workshop where he taught me how to repair broken furniture instead of throwing it away. The tiny kitchen where he insisted homemade bread always tasted better when shared. A year before he died, he invited me over one Sunday afternoon. He looked healthier than he had in months. His voice was steady. His thoughts were perfectly clear. He opened a small fireproof box and removed several folders. One of them had my name written neatly across the front. He smiled. "I want you to have the house someday. Not because it's expensive, because you'll protect it. Ryan would sell it within a week. Your parents will try to convince you otherwise. Don't argue with them. Just keep every paper I give you." I laughed nervously. Why would anyone argue? He only looked out the window. Because money changes people faster than grief. At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious. He handed me certified copies of several legal documents and told me to store them somewhere no one could reach. I rented a safe deposit box the very next morning. Then life became busy. Work demanded longer hours. Grandpa's health declined faster than any of us expected. When he passed away, the funeral was crowded with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone cried. Everyone praised his generosity. Then, before the flowers had even started to fade, conversations quietly shifted toward his property. My mother insisted everything would be handled within the family. Dad repeatedly told me not to worry about legal paperwork because he had already spoken with attorneys. Ryan kept asking whether anyone knew how much the house could sell for in the current market. Something about that question bothered me, but I convinced myself grief made people speak carelessly. Months passed. Every time I asked about the estate, I received the same answer. We're still waiting. There are delays. These things take time. I accepted those explanations because they sounded reasonable. Until one ordinary Tuesday morning, while reviewing property tax records for an unrelated investigation at work, I absent-mindedly searched my grandfather's address. A habit, nothing more. The screen loaded, then my heartbeat stopped. The ownership information had changed. Not recently, nearly 5 months earlier. Someone had transferred the property, and my name appeared nowhere on the record. I stared at the monitor. Then I searched again. The same result appeared. Whoever had taken the house had done it long before my parents ever told me the estate was still unfinished. That was the moment I stopped trusting their words and started following the evidence instead. The first rule of forensic accounting is painfully simple. Never assume. Verify everything. I left work early that afternoon and drove straight to the county records office. I told myself there had to be a mistake, a clerical error, an outdated database, anything except what my instincts were already screaming. The clerk behind the counter smiled politely as she printed the public record. I thanked her, walked outside, sat in my car. Then I started reading. Every page made my stomach heavier. The transfer had not happened after my grandfather died. It happened almost 2 months before his funeral. The property had first been moved into what appeared to be a family management trust. 3 weeks later, that trust sold the house to a private buyer. Everything looked clean, professional, almost perfect, almost. One signature caught my attention immediately, my grandfather's. I had spent years examining handwriting during fraud investigations, not as a handwriting expert, as someone trained to notice inconsistencies. His signature looked right at first glance. The same looping W, the same long underline. But something felt wrong. The pressure changed halfway through. The final letters were unnaturally slow. It looked less like one continuous motion and more like someone carefully recreating it. I took a photograph of every page. Then I drove directly to the bank. The safe deposit box was exactly where I had left it. I unlocked it. Inside rested the gray folder Grandpa had handed me. Every document remained untouched: his trust agreement, certified copies of the deed, several handwritten notes, and one sealed envelope. Across the front he had written only 4 words: "For Evelyn, if needed." My hands trembled. For several minutes I simply stared at it. Part of me felt guilty opening something he had intended for a future I never imagined. Another part already knew this was why he had prepared it. Inside was a letter. His handwriting was unmistakable, strong, confident, steady. If you are reading this, someone has probably told you that my wishes changed. Do not believe words, believe documents. The trust cannot be amended without the attached authorization page. Keep it safe. There is only one original. Without it, any transfer made outside the trust should be questioned. I stopped reading. Attached behind the letter was a single notarized page. The original authorization certificate, a page that was nowhere in the county records. I compared every seal, every signature, every date. Everything matched, except one thing. The authorization number on my original certificate did not appear anywhere in the documents used to sell the house. Someone had completed the transaction without the only page my grandfather specifically said was required. I suddenly understood why my parents had spent months telling me not to contact any lawyers. They never knew Grandpa had given me the original documents. That evening, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. We finally sold the house. You'll understand one day that this was best for everyone. Ryan needed a fresh start. You always land on your feet anyway. I closed my eyes. Ryan, of course. Everything suddenly fit together. His failed business, his mounting debts, the expensive truck he somehow bought a few weeks earlier, the vacation photos his wife had posted online. None of it had made sense before. Now it did. I asked one question. Did Grandpa ever tell you he left me any paperwork? Silence. Only for 2 seconds. Then she laughed. No, dear, there wasn't anything important. That tiny hesitation lasted less than a heartbeat. For anyone else, it would have meant nothing. For me, it confirmed everything. She wasn't remembering. She was deciding what lie to tell. After hanging up, I made 3 calls. The first was to a probate attorney. The second was to a title insurance investigator I had worked with years earlier. The third was to Margaret Lawson. She had practiced estate law for over 40 years. More importantly, she had drafted my grandfather's trust herself before retiring. When she heard my name, she became unusually quiet. Then she asked a question that sent a chill through my entire body. Evelyn, has anyone else seen the original authorization certificate? I looked down at the page still lying on my desk. No. Good, she whispered. Then don't tell anyone you have it. Before I could ask why, she took a slow breath. Because if what you're describing is accurate, she paused. Someone didn't just ignore your grandfather's wishes. They built the entire sale around the assumption that this paper no longer existed. I barely slept that night, not because I was afraid, because my mind refused to stop connecting the pieces. Every lie my parents had told over the past year suddenly had a place. Every delay, every excuse, every conversation that ended the moment I walked into the room. At 7 the next morning, I met Margaret Lawson at her office. Retirement clearly suited her. The walls were covered with family photographs instead of legal certificates. Yet the sharpness in her eyes had not faded at all. She greeted me with a warm hug before asking for the folder. She examined every page without saying a word. 20 minutes passed. Then she looked up. These are the originals. I thought so. No, she corrected gently. You don't understand. These aren't certified copies. Walter gave you the master documents. I frowned. I don't see the difference. It makes all the difference. She opened the trust agreement to the final section. There were only 3 original sets. One stayed with Walter. One stayed in my office until I retired. The third, she tapped the folder. This one. What happened to yours? I transferred every original to the attorney who took over my practice. And Grandpa's? No idea. For the first time that morning, genuine concern crossed her face. If someone wanted to bypass the trust, removing the original documents would have been the first step. She picked up the authorization certificate again. They clearly believed every original had disappeared. I finally asked the question that had been haunting me. Can we reverse the sale? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another document. The buyers appear to have purchased the property in good faith. So they keep the house, most likely. I felt my shoulders sink. So I lose. She smiled. No. She slid another paper across the desk. You don't need the house, you need accountability. I looked at the page. It was a distribution schedule attached to the trust. According to Grandpa's instructions, the house could only be sold if I personally approved the transaction in writing. Otherwise, ownership remained protected by the trust. My signature was nowhere. Margaret folded her hands. The buyers aren't your problem. Who is? The people who falsely represented they had authority to sell. A quiet knock interrupted us. A man in his early 40s stepped into the office carrying 2 thick binders. Margaret introduced him. This is Daniel Reed. He specialized in property fraud litigation. He had already reviewed the county records before arriving. Daniel shook my hand. Your grandfather kept excellent records. He always believed paperwork mattered. Daniel smiled. He was right. He opened the first binder. We traced where the sale proceeds went. I leaned forward. There were 6 transfers within 48 hours. He pointed to highlighted transactions. The escrow company released the funds. $180,000 went into a joint account belonging to your parents. $60,000 paid off business loans connected to Ryan. $20,000 purchased a luxury pickup. The remaining funds covered credit cards, vacations, and home renovations. None of it surprised me anymore, not really. What hurt was how quickly they had spent it. As if Grandpa's lifetime of work had been nothing more than a lottery ticket. Daniel turned another page. There's something else. He showed me copies of email correspondence obtained through discovery requests in another unrelated case involving the title company. One message caught my eye. My father's name. The subject line simply read, "Keep Evelyn uninformed until closing." I read it again, then a third time. There it was, written plainly, no hidden meaning. No misunderstanding. My parents had not forgotten to tell me. They had planned not to tell me. Margaret quietly closed the binder. Intent matters. I whispered the words almost to myself. They knew. Daniel nodded. They absolutely knew. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, I asked the only question left. When do we tell them? Daniel exchanged a glance with Margaret. We don't. I looked up. What do you mean? He smiled slightly. We let them believe they've won. They'll keep spending. They'll keep talking. They'll keep creating evidence. He pushed a legal calendar toward me. The family dinner this Saturday. I nodded. My mother hosted one every month. Attendance was practically mandatory. Daniel tapped the date. They invited you because they think you're defeated. Margaret leaned forward. So go, smile, eat dinner, say nothing. I frowned. And then, Daniel closed the binder with a soft thud. Then we let them celebrate. He reached into his briefcase and placed a sealed envelope in front of me. On the front was one sentence. Do not open until Saturday night. I stared at it. What is this? Daniel's expression didn't change. The document that turns this from a civil dispute. He paused just long enough for my pulse to quicken. Into something your parents will never see coming. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. Blue skies, warm air. The kind of afternoon my mother always described as a blessing. By 6 o'clock, their backyard looked like something from a lifestyle magazine. Fresh flowers covered every table. Ryan stood beside the grill, laughing with friends. My father carried expensive bottles of wine from the kitchen as though he had won the lottery. Maybe he thought he had. I parked across the street and sat inside my car for another minute. The sealed envelope rested on the passenger seat. I still hadn't opened it. Daniel had been very specific. Only after everyone was together, only after they believed the evening belonged to them. I slipped the envelope into my bag and walked toward the house. My mother greeted me with a hug that felt rehearsed. There she is. I was starting to think you wouldn't come. I almost didn't. She laughed awkwardly. Oh, Evelyn, it's time to move forward. Move forward. That phrase again. It had become her favorite way of pretending the past no longer mattered. Ryan walked over carrying 2 glasses of champagne. You should celebrate. I have nothing to celebrate. He shrugged. Come on, it's just a house. I looked directly into his eyes. No, it was my grandfather. For a brief second, guilt crossed his face. Then it disappeared. Dinner began exactly at 7. The conversation never drifted far from money. My parents talked about remodeling their kitchen. Ryan mentioned a lake house he and his wife wanted to buy next summer. His wife excitedly described designer furniture she had already ordered. Every sentence sounded like another withdrawal from Grandpa's life's work. I barely touched my food. Instead, I listened. Years of interviewing witnesses had taught me something important. People who believe they are safe often reveal far more than they intend. My father raised his glass. To family. Everyone smiled. I did not. Then he looked at me. I hope there are no hard feelings anymore, I answered calmly. Were there supposed to be? He chuckled. I knew you'd understand eventually. Understand what? That your grandfather trusted us to make difficult decisions. I tilted my head. Did he? Of course. You know he changed his mind near the end. I let several seconds pass before asking quietly. When exactly did he change his mind? Dad hesitated. Oh, sometime during the winter before he passed. Ryan nodded immediately. I remember that. So did my mother. Yes, he didn't want you carrying the burden. 3 people, 1 identical story, 1 problem. My grandfather had spent that entire winter recovering in another state with my aunt. They couldn't even keep the timeline straight. I opened my handbag, removed the sealed envelope, and finally broke it open. Inside were only 3 documents. The first was a certified transcript from Margaret Lawson confirming she had prepared the trust. The second was the escrow instruction showing who had claimed legal authority to approve the sale. The third made my heart beat slow instead of race. It was a digital access certificate. Attached was a handwritten note from Daniel. Walter installed security cameras throughout the property during the final year of his life. The recordings were automatically archived off-site. Review the folder named January 23rd. I looked at the date. It was the exact day my father claimed Grandpa had changed his wishes. I scanned the QR code with my phone. Within seconds, the video appeared. The picture wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Grandpa sat in his kitchen, healthy, alert. Across from him sat Margaret Lawson. They reviewed the trust page by page. Then Grandpa looked directly toward the camera. If anyone ever says I changed this trust after today, they're lying. He smiled. I've spent my whole life making careful decisions. This is one of them. Margaret asked one final question. Do you still want Evelyn to receive the house through the trust? He answered without hesitation. Absolutely. I trust her judgment. Not anyone else's. The recording ended. Silence covered the table. Ryan stared at my phone. My mother's face had turned completely white. Dad reached for the device. I moved it away before he could touch it. His voice was suddenly much quieter. Where did you get that? I didn't. Grandpa left it. Nobody spoke. Then Ryan whispered the words none of them had expected to say. We didn't know he recorded that. I looked at him. You weren't supposed to know. The sentence escaped before he could stop it. He covered his mouth. Too late. Daniel had warned me. Let them believe they've won. Eventually, they stopped protecting themselves. I stood slowly. There is one more thing. Everyone watched. I placed the final document on the center of the table. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. It was a formal notice. Every bank account that had received proceeds from the sale had been served with an emergency preservation order only 30 minutes earlier. The money they thought was safely theirs could no longer be moved. And somewhere across town, investigators were already knocking on the door of the escrow company whose manager had just admitted under oath that someone inside my own family instructed him to keep me from learning about the sale. Nobody moved. Not my father, not my mother, not Ryan. The only sound came from the wind rustling through the maple tree in the backyard. My father finally found his voice. You froze our accounts? I didn't. The court did. His face hardened. You planned this. I nodded. No, I documented it. There was a difference, a very important difference. Ryan suddenly stood up. This is insane. We're family. You could have talked to us. I looked at him for several long seconds. I tried. For months. You ignored every call. You told me not to worry. You lied. His shoulders dropped. He had no answer. My mother began to cry. Real tears this time. Evelyn, we only wanted to help Ryan. I know. He was drowning. I know. We thought you'd understand. I understand perfectly. You decided that sacrificing one child was easier than telling the other the truth. She covered her face with both hands. My father slammed his palm against the table. You have no idea what pressure I was under. I met his eyes. No. I know exactly what pressure feels like. I spent years cleaning up financial disasters created by strangers. I never imagined I'd have to investigate my own parents. The backyard had become completely silent. Even Ryan's friends quietly stepped away toward the patio, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Dad took a deep breath. You don't want criminal charges. I don't decide that. The investigators do. His expression changed. For the first time that evening, confidence disappeared. He realized this was no longer a family argument. It was evidence. Evidence doesn't negotiate. 20 minutes later, Daniel walked through the backyard gate. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a navy jacket and carrying a leather briefcase. He looked more like a neighbor than an attorney. He shook my hand, then addressed my parents. I'm Daniel Reed. I represent Evelyn. My father laughed bitterly. So this is your victory lap. Daniel ignored the comment. He opened the briefcase and removed several envelopes. These are copies of the preservation orders. These are notices of pending civil litigation. And these he placed the final folder on the table. Contained statements from the escrow manager. Ryan stared at him. What statements? Daniel opened one page. The manager admits he received repeated instructions not to contact Evelyn, despite knowing the trust listed her as the primary beneficiary. My mother's breathing became uneven. Daniel continued. He also confirmed he was told that if Evelyn called, he should say the closing had been delayed. Dad whispered one word. No. Daniel looked directly at him. He saved every email. Every email. I watched my father's face lose color. Years ago, he had taught me never to leave a paper trail. Apparently, he had forgotten his own advice. Daniel spoke calmly. Yesterday, he agreed to cooperate fully. He also produced audio recordings of 2 meetings. Ryan turned toward Dad. You met with him without telling me? Dad didn't answer. Ryan looked at Mom. You knew? She lowered her eyes. The cracks that had existed beneath the surface for years finally widened. Ryan took a step backward. You both told me everything was legal. It was supposed to be. Dad answered too quickly. Ryan shook his head. You promised. You said Grandpa wanted this. No one replied. The silence was louder than any confession. Ryan slowly sat back down. I sold my old house because you said this money was safe. I borrowed against it. I signed contracts. His voice cracked. What have you done? For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something unexpected. Not anger, fear, not fear for himself. Fear because he finally understood that our parents had manipulated him too. They had used his desperation to justify betraying me. Daniel quietly closed the folder. There is one final matter. He handed me another document. Margaret had already explained it. Now it was official. The buyers acted in good faith. They will keep the property. I felt an ache deep inside my chest. I had known that was coming. It still hurt. Daniel continued. But the trust calculates the value of Evelyn's loss. He turned the page, with interest, with legal costs, with punitive damages requested because of intentional concealment. The total appeared at the bottom. My mother gasped. Ryan whispered the number aloud. $812,000. My father stared at the page as though it were written in another language. That's impossible, Daniel answered quietly. No. It is the legal consequence of treating a trust as if it belonged to you. My father looked at me, almost pleading. What do you want? It was the question everyone expected. Money, revenge, punishment. Instead, I answered honestly. I want the truth, in court, under oath, and I want Grandpa's name cleared. I stood, picked up my bag, then looked around the table one last time. For years I had believed this family was breaking because of money. I finally understood the truth. Money hadn't destroyed us. It had simply revealed who everyone already was. As I walked toward my car, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Daniel. The escrow manager just signed the final affidavit. Then another message arrived from Margaret. There is one more document Walter left behind. You need to see it before tomorrow's hearing. I stopped walking. Grandpa had planned one final surprise. And somehow it was even bigger than the trust itself. I arrived at the courthouse before sunrise. The building was almost empty. Only a security officer, a janitor polishing the marble floors, and a few attorneys carrying oversized briefcases moved through the quiet hallways. Margaret was already waiting. She smiled when she saw me. You look calmer. I am. She nodded. That's how I know you're ready. We sat together in a small conference room. She placed an old leather journal on the table. Its cover was cracked from years of use. This belonged to Walter. I found it yesterday inside a sealed archive box. I carefully opened the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a record. Every important conversation, every meeting with lawyers, every decision regarding the trust. My grandfather had documented everything. Dates, names, witnesses, even reasons for his decisions. Margaret pointed to one entry written 18 months before he died. I have changed the trust today. Not because I love Ryan less, Because I know Evelyn will protect this family if she ever has to. Ryan still believes love means never hearing the word no. His parents encourage that belief. I pray one day they understand what it will cost. A tear landed on the page before I could wipe it away. Grandpa hadn't been choosing favorites. He had been trying to protect everyone, including Ryan. The courtroom filled slowly. My parents sat with their attorney across the aisle. Neither of them looked at me. Ryan entered alone. He walked over quietly. I need to tell you something. I waited. I didn't know. I know. I really didn't. I know. He swallowed hard. I signed an affidavit this morning. That surprised me. I told investigators everything. Every conversation. Every email they asked about. I searched his face. For the first time in years, I saw the younger brother I remembered before money had changed everything. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I should have asked more questions. You should have. I know. There was nothing else to say. The hearing lasted almost 4 hours. Experts testified. Bank records appeared on large screens. Email chains were read aloud. The escrow manager admitted that my father repeatedly insisted I should never be contacted because I was, in his words, too emotional to understand complicated financial matters. The judge asked one question. Did you ever verify whether Ms. Evelyn had legal authority under the trust? The manager lowered his head. No. Why not? Because I relied on representations made by her parents. The courtroom fell silent. Then Margaret presented the final document, Grandpa's journal. It wasn't introduced to prove ownership. That had already been established. It proved intent. It showed in Grandpa's own handwriting that he had anticipated exactly the kind of manipulation that eventually happened. The judge spent nearly 20 minutes reading selected passages. When she finally looked up, her expression had completely changed. She addressed my parents directly. This court has seen many inheritance disputes. This is not one of them. This is a deliberate effort to ignore a trust, conceal information from its beneficiary, and profit from that concealment. Neither of my parents spoke. Their attorney quietly closed his notebook. He knew. Everyone knew. Everyone. The decision came 3 weeks later. The buyers kept the house. They had acted honestly. I was relieved. An innocent family would not lose their home because of someone else's deception. But everything else changed. The court ordered my parents to reimburse the trust for the full value of the property. Interest, attorney fees, court costs. The civil judgment exceeded $800,000. The Professional Licensing Board permanently sanctioned the escrow manager. The title company implemented new verification procedures because of the case. Ryan declared personal bankruptcy after admitting he could not repay the loans he had taken against money that was never truly his. He never blamed me, not once. Instead, he entered counseling, found steady work. 2 years later, he sent me a letter, not asking for forgiveness, not asking for money, simply thanking me for refusing to keep protecting lies. As for my parents, they never served prison time. The investigators concluded that restitution and the overwhelming documentary evidence made a lengthy criminal trial unnecessary after they accepted responsibility and entered into a formal settlement agreement. They lost far more than money, their reputation, their credibility, most painfully, the trust of the people they loved. Nearly a year after everything ended, I drove past Grandpa's old house. Children were playing in the front yard. The porch had been repainted. The maple trees were even taller. I smiled. The house was alive, exactly as Grandpa would have wanted. I didn't stop the car. I didn't need to. Home had never been about owning those walls. It had always been about carrying forward the values that were built inside them. A few months later, using part of the settlement, I established the Walter Bennett Trust for Family Integrity. It provides legal assistance to older adults who fear financial exploitation and helps families understand estate planning before conflict begins. Every grant carries the same sentence printed beneath Grandpa's signature. Believe documents, not promises. People often ask whether I regret taking my parents to court. The answer is no. I never wanted revenge. Revenge would have ended the day I won. Justice lasts much longer. Justice protected my grandfather's wishes. Justice forced the truth into the light. Justice allowed me to stop being the quiet daughter who apologized for everyone else's choices. I finally became the woman my grandfather always believed I already was. And that turned out to be the greatest inheritance he could ever leave me.